Welcome to the Situation Room, where this week we're zeroing in on continental Europe. First, we examine the war waging in the European East, where new data on Russian and Ukrainian casualty numbers suggests that the costs of the three-year war are even more horrific than we previously imagined. Then we turn to France and the most populous nation in South America, Brazil, to explore the possibility that a pair of legal decisions against prominent political leaders could become a cause for civil unrest. And finally, we'll examine Europe's coalition of the willing as it slowly takes shape, and we'll evaluate whether this force could really carry out a rapid deployment to Ukraine, as the coalition's leaders have suggested. Timestamps are below in the description, but if you like what we do, and you like learning, stick around, watch the whole thing. Why not? It's one of the biggest mysteries surrounding our planet's most important war. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the one thing nearly everyone can agree on is that the conflict has been marked by extreme bloodshed. From the sight of frozen Russian corpses abandoned by their comrades in the war's opening days, to the endless stream of bodies left by Ukraine's failed 2023 counteroffensive, the fighting has chewed through uncountable young lives. But try and count exactly how many, and things get murky. While everyone knows a lot of Russians and Ukrainians have died, putting an actual number on it is the stuff of bitter arguments. The Kremlin, for example, has not updated its official death toll since September of 2022, when it claimed that fewer than 6,000 of its troops had perished, a claim about as believable as an episode of Ancient Aliens.
Is such a thing even possible? Yes, it is.
At the other end of the scale, US intelligence has recently given an astronomical figure of 700,000 dead and wounded Russians. As the Kyiv Independent points out, for comparison, the UK suffered 750,000 military casualties during the 6 years of World War II. Given all the fire and fury surrounding these competing narratives, it's been vital to have an objective, verifiable list of the dead. A database that anyone can access and know for an absolute fact that any name listed there, A, belonged to a real person, and B, this person died fighting for Moscow. A database like the one compiled by the independent Russian outlet Mediazona in collaboration with the BBC. Starting in the earliest days of the war, the researchers began logging every single verifiable death among Russia's forces. The key word there is verifiable. To show up on the Mediazona named list, there must be hard corroborating evidence of the subject's life and death. The BBC explains how, quote, "The list includes names of the deceased that we verified using information from official reports, newspapers, social media, and new memorials and graves." Because each entry requires direct evidence, the Mediazona count has always been among the most conservative death tolls out there. And with good reason. The researchers know that letting fake or exaggerated reports through would kill their credibility. So it is a testament to their research that when they made the entire list public, only 100 duplicate entries were found among tens of thousands of names. We mention all of this to really impress on you just how solid this work is. When the Mediazona BBC named list gives us a figure of Russian war dead, we can take it as an absolute guaranteed minimum death toll. One untainted by any form of bias or wishful thinking. All of which is why the list's bi-weekly update on March the 28th was so notable. After 37 months of fighting, the named list tally finally crossed 100,000. As Mediazona wrote, "The number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine, those whose names we've been able to confirm, has now surpassed 100,000. To put that in perspective, the previous worst conflict fought by Russia post-1945 was the Soviet-Afghan War, which is thought to have killed 15,000 Soviet troops between 1979 and 1989. The Ukraine conflict, by contrast, has killed over 6.5 times as many men in less than a third of that time. If you were to add together all of the direct combat deaths America suffered in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined, there would still be fewer coffins than for this one special military operation. The remarkable part, even this headline figure is almost certainly an undercount. The team note that they already have a backlog of 10,000 additional obituaries that they need to verify. While some of those will probably be duplicates, several thousand will likely be confirmed in the coming weeks. Aside from the lag time between someone dying and an obituary being verified, there are other reasons why the 100,000 figure is probably an undercount. One being that some who die simply leave no publicly visible traces. No obituaries mark their passing, or perhaps they're lost amid such thick fighting that they are only ever listed as missing. Because of this, both Mediazona and the BBC emphasize that the real death toll is believed to be much higher than the named list, although they disagree about how best to estimate the true numbers. Mediazona collaborates with another independent Russian outlet, Meduza, on the probate registry count. Here's how their researchers explain it. Quote, Russia maintains a public probate registry where notaries record inheritance cases for state-registered assets such as apartments, cars, land, etc. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, there was a sharp increase in new inheritance cases for men, particularly younger ones. By comparing this surge against long-term trends and the ratio of male-to-female inheritance cases, female mortality was unaffected by the war, we can determine the number of excess inheritance cases. End quote. Through complicated statistical modeling, these excess cases can be used to project a more likely death toll. As of their last update on December 31st, 2024, the probate count estimated a total of 165,000 Russian deaths. Although a great tool for outside researchers, the disadvantage of the probate count is that there is a seriously long lag time between someone dying and that becoming visible in the data. Hence why the BBC instead consults with military experts to try and determine a realistic range of additional deaths. In their February update, they noted that the named list, quote, probably only captures 45 to 65% of total casualties. Using these figures as a ballpark, they estimate, therefore, that, quoting again, the true number of Russian military deaths could range from 146,194 to 211,169. And even if we only take the lowest estimate of those models, the roughly 146,000 suggested by the BBC, well, that would still make the Ukraine war almost 10 times as deadly for Russia as the Soviet-Afghan war. To put it in an American context, you would need to combine all the US direct combat deaths in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and World War I to reach a similar figure. Nor does even this toll include everyone who has fought for Moscow. Because they are focused on Russia itself, neither the named list nor the probate count includes those who fought and died for the Russia-backed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which broke off from Ukraine in 2014. According to the BBC, quoting again, the figure doesn't include those who were killed serving in the militia of the self-proclaimed Donbass republics, which we estimate to be between 21 and 23,500 fighters. End quote. As such, the likely minimum death toll for those fighting on Russia's side, combining the lowest-end BBC estimate plus the Donbass militia deaths, is about 164,000, and that figure still excludes any foreign mercenaries. Despite that being a truly staggering number, though, some of you might be watching this and thinking, that doesn't seem like that much. And look, there are two likely reasons for this. One is that you're used to seeing casualty figures that run into the many hundreds of thousands. As we mentioned earlier, US intelligence believes that the war has seen 700,000 Russian casualties, while President Trump not so long ago gave a figure of 1 million.
We have numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed.
But while such figures include those killed, they also include many other ways of knocking a soldier out of combat. That means the wounded, the missing, and depending on who's counting, possibly even those who've been captured. The Mediazone accounts, by contrast, include only those who've been killed. The other possible reason is that you're aware of Russia's sheer size and know that 164,000 is the mere tiniest fraction of a population of 143.8 million. Although it's worth reminding everyone that only a small percent of that population will be males of fighting age, and they're the ones who've already been devastated by the war. As The Economist writes, quote, despite Russia's size advantage, these numbers suggest that roughly 1 in 30 men between the ages of 20 and 49 has been killed or injured in the past 3 years. And it's here that we get to the most interesting part of the data. By digging down deeper, we can see the broader effects the war has had both on Russia's military and on its wider society. The first tidbit the Mediazona and BBC data gives us is information on how the war has affected different classes of society at different times. So, in the earliest days of the war, we can see that the ones being killed were professional soldiers as the initial 3-day operation to take Kiev turned into a bloody debacle. Among those who suffered the worst were the airborne forces and the motorized rifle troops, while the officer class was also decimated. According to the data, 1 in 10 of those killed in the early days were officers. This mass destruction of elite units and officers is likely one reason why Russia's tactics became so simplistic in subsequent stages of the war, grinding forward with artillery barrages and human wave assaults. With the best soldiers and their leaders dead, it does become harder to do complex operations. There's also the impact of who replaced these elite units on the front lines. Mediazona writes that by March of 2023, the largest class of those being killed in Ukraine were prisoners recruited into the Wagner Group. This culminated with the capture of Bakhmut, though so many prisoners died that they remained the largest class of deceased for some time. By September last year, though, volunteers had overtaken them, showing the relative success the Kremlin had had in luring people into the army with gigantic signing bonuses. But while it's informative to look into the types of people who've been killed in Ukraine, perhaps more revealing is knowing where they came from. Because the distribution of deaths reveals a lot about where Russia is at today. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the sight of endless coffins returning with the USSR's dead sons galvanized a protest movement across the empire, one mostly led by the soldiers' mothers. This time, though, there's been nothing similar, despite a far higher number of troops being killed. Now, one reason for that could be due to the types of people dying. Rather than conscripts or professional soldiers, those marching into the Ukrainian meat grinder have tended to be prisoners or volunteer recruits. But it could also be related to where the dead come from, because breaking deaths down by region shows the burden of the fighting is being disproportionately borne by those from poorer regions. If we look at Moscow, for example, the war-related death rate among the population is 3 per 10,000. In Leningrad region, which surrounds St. Petersburg, it's 14 per 10,000. Zip across the map to Central Asia, though, and the Buryatia region has suffered 77 deaths per 10,000. Right next door is the Taiva Republic, where the number reaches an incredible 104. You can make these sorts of observations all across the map. The pattern seems to be that those right now fighting and dying in Ukraine come from the poorer, non-ethnically Russian regions, while the elites in the western cities are so unaffected that the war is all but invisible. As the director of the Russia Institute at King's College London told the BBC, quoting here, "The Kremlin seems to have designed it this way, ensuring that the most privileged sections of society remain largely disconnected from the war, hence recruitment of prisoners and foreign mercenaries." End quote. Now, this may explain why the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics have suffered such catastrophic casualties. Although Putin annexed them into Russia in autumn of 2022, the Kremlin doesn't seem to actually see them as Russian. Rather, they're useful cannon fodder who can die to shield the urban elites from the true cost of the war. Now, the obvious question is whether Putin can continue to keep the costs of the war concentrated on the poorer and weaker parts of society, or whether he'll eventually have to start exposing Muscovites to the slaughter. And honestly, that's a question we don't have the answer to. Certainly no society can keep up a high rate of frontline deaths indefinitely. Using probate count data, independent outlet Medusa estimates that last autumn saw roughly 2,000 Russian soldiers dying every week. And that's just deaths. Add in the wounded and missing, and the numbers are much higher. The UK Ministry of Defence estimates that December saw an average of 1,500 Russian soldiers being taken off the board each and every day. And for what? The Economist calculates that the Kremlin captured a mere 0.57% of Ukrainian territory over the whole of 2024. Of course, winning a war is not just about capturing territory at a steady pace. If your opponent is suffering casualties at a less sustainable rate than you are, then you're going to eventually win. And all of that brings us to the next unknown factor: Ukrainian casualties. According to President Zelensky's office, 43,000 Ukrainians have died in the war so far, a number which most serious analysts dismiss as a massive undercount. Perhaps more accurate is the leaked Ukrainian intelligence report from last autumn. That document, dated September 2024, estimated around 80,000 Ukrainian deaths to that point, but even this may disguise the true scale of losses. The website UA Losses is an attempt to do for Kyiv what the Media Zone account has done for Moscow, to get a reasonably accurate bare minimum figure for servicemen killed in action. As of an update on March 29th, it lists 72,247 confirmed deaths. Researchers who studied random samples of the database have found it to be accurate, meaning this figure is likely the equivalent of the Media Zone named list. If someone's details are entered there, you can be sure that they died fighting for Ukraine. But UA Losses also records another type of statistic: the missing. And it's here that the figures get interesting. Due to the nature of the fighting, it's believed that a ton of Ukrainian deaths are officially listed as missing. By combining the two figures, UA Losses arrives at a grim figure of 133,666 probable Ukrainian deaths. To be clear, some of these missing will be deserters. Others will have been captured with their whereabouts unknown. But the majority are dead. And that means roughly 133,000 may be the current best guess that we have for Ukrainian deaths. As such, it's important which of the Russian death tolls is more accurate. If it's closer to the bare minimum estimate of 164,000 when factoring in those killed for the Donbass republics, then it's possible that Russia, with its far bigger population, has only suffered a few tens of thousand extra deaths than Ukraine. And that would spell serious trouble for Kyiv. On the other hand, the upper end of the BBC's estimate, plus the Donbass Republic deaths, would yield a figure for Russia-aligned deaths that is over 100,000 higher than Ukraine's casualties. And that would suggest that the Kremlin is throwing away lives at such a rate as to negate its size advantage. The truth is likely not going to come out until the war's end. So for now, all we can do is rely on solid research by organizations like Mediazona and UA Losses to provide us with bare minimum baselines. Yet even if we only take the 100,000 Russian deaths on the named list and the roughly 72,000 confirmed dead by UA Losses, it's still clear that this is a spectacularly bloody war. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the bloodiest conflict fought on European soil since 1945 was the Bosnian War in the early 1990s. That conflagration killed around 100,000 people and caused shock around the globe, yet it now appears the merest drop in the ocean beside the bloody tide of the Ukraine war. And the saddest part? The killing is likely to continue. Even if a ceasefire deal is reached in the coming months, no one seriously believes that it'll be anything but a pause. A chance for Russia to replenish its battered army before launching yet another attempt to subjugate Ukraine. The data may already show that this is the bloodiest European war in the last 80 years, but the real horrors could be yet to come. And just before we move on to the next segment, we want to briefly touch on the major source that we used in this story, the named list published by Mediazona. Since 2022, Mediazona has been one of the single best resources for anyone who wishes to understand Russia's wartime society. Not only do they maintain the named list of the dead, they also cover so many different aspects of life in today's Russia that you've almost certainly seen us reference their reporting here on WarFronts. And now, they need help. This is not a sponsored plug. We just felt that this is something that we should do. They're cut off from their Russian subscriber base, they're forced into exile, and Mediazona is in danger of going bankrupt. Already their editors are working for free, journalists' salaries are being slashed, the funds to maintain the named list that analysis channels like us rely on are running dry. So we're going to help them out, and we'd like you to do so as well. In the video description, you'll find a link to donate to Mediazona. They accept American and European cards, PayPal, and crypto, and as little as $10 a month will help them keep publishing vital stuff like the named list and the probate counts. Like we said, we will be donating. It would be fantastic if you could as well. This is obviously not sponsored. They don't have the money for that. They need money. So yeah, if you can, please do. If you can't, it is what it is. Donate.zona.media/EN. There's a link below. And now, the next story. Next up, we turn and take a look at two nations, France and Brazil, where judicial decisions centered on powerful right-wing leaders have the potential to prompt real unrest among the public. In Brazil, former President Jair Bolsonaro has been ordered to stand trial by the nation's Supreme Court after what national prosecutors allege was an attempted coup back in 2022. In France, an embezzlement conviction against longtime leader of the national far-right Marine Le Pen has seen her disqualified from the nation's presidential election in 2024. Now, before we move on and discuss the details of either situation, we've got to make one thing clear. We're a conflicts channel, we're not a politics channel, and wading into the national discourse in either Brazil or France is beyond our purview in today's episode. Instead, we're going to be taking a strictly instrumental approach to these two legal decisions and focus on the potential for civil unrest and the wider geopolitical implications that spiral out from both of them. Make no mistake, even in stable, peaceful nations, major and divisive judicial decisions against national political leaders carry immense potential for social upheaval. Just take the aftermath of South Korea's failed coup attempt last year, or the mass protests happening in the nation of Turkey as we speak after the jailing of President Erdogan's primary political opponent. Brazil and France have each seen mass public action in recent years, and arguably, the verdicts handed down last week represent a greater shock to the system than either nation has experienced in years. So with that frame in mind, let's discuss the cases. For Marine Le Pen, the guilty verdict handed down by a Paris criminal court was for an embezzlement charge, with Le Pen now found to have misused several million euros worth of European Parliament funds between the years 2004 and 2016. Le Pen was not found guilty of personal enrichment using the money, but was instead at the center of a network of misappropriations in which staff members of her own political party, the National Rally, were paid with money that had been intended to go to aids assisting lawmakers across Europe. The 56-year-old Le Pen has also been sentenced to 4 years in prison, including 2 years that have been suspended and 2 that she'll likely serve under house arrest. She'll also have to pay a fine of 100,000 euros. Most important, however, she is declared ineligible to run in France's presidential elections in 2027, where she would have been a top candidate to win the open presidency, left behind by the term-limited current executive, Emmanuel Macron. Le Pen has vowed to appeal the case and may have some success in doing so, but it's unclear that her case will be able to move through France's lethargic appeal system and get a more favourable ruling with enough time to mount a successful presidential bid. Present, a Paris appeals court expects to issue rulings no sooner than summer 2026, and that process could be slowed down further in advance of the April 2027 election. Le Pen will retain her current seat in the French National Assembly, but will be ineligible to run and try and keep her seat if Macron calls a snap election between now and the presidential vote. In Brazil, the situation for Jair Bolsonaro is a good bit different, with Bolsonaro not having been found guilty of anything at this time. He has, however, been ordered to stand trial for attempting an alleged failed coup d'etat in 2022, alongside at least 33 co-conspirators, including several prominent political allies. According to Brazil's Prosecutor General, operating under the authority of Bolsonaro's successor and political opponent, President Lula da Silva, Bolsonaro and his co-conspirators had plans in place to poison Lula, kill a judge who sits on the Brazilian Supreme Court, and retain power by force in a complex plan that appears to have only failed because the commander of the Brazilian army got cold feet at the last minute. Under Brazilian law, Bolsonaro could serve up to 12 years in prison on the charge of attempting a coup alone, even before the other charges are accounted for. Altogether, he could face over 40 years behind bars. Like Le Pen, Bolsonaro has denied the charges against him, and like Le Pen, he's accused the government in power of orchestrating political persecution against him. Bolsonaro is already banned from any further runs for political office until 2030, and a trial date has not yet been set in a process that could potentially drag on for quite a while. When assessing the risk of unrest or even political violence in each nation, the best place to start is by measuring both figures' popularity in their home nations. Brazil's Bolsonaro consistently polled at around a 40% favourable rating in 2024, and although he's experienced a bit of attrition since then, his support among his political base has been just about unwavering. That's despite a widespread consensus among that same portion of the Brazilian public that Bolsonaro is likely to be found guilty in his upcoming trial, not necessarily because they believe him to be guilty, but because of a broader perceived politicization of the Brazilian justice system. Meanwhile, Le Pen is popular across much of France, with an opinion poll published on Sunday, March the 30th, prior to her guilty verdict, finding that Le Pen drew support from a full 37% of the polled electorate in a hypothetical 2027 presidential election. That is a 10-point lead on every other candidate offered in that poll, and more than double her showing in 2022 for an election Le Pen has openly said would be her last. Le Pen has spent years distancing herself politically from the legacy of her father, a longtime leader of the hard right, while working to make her party's views more mainstream. Like in Bolsonaro's case, Le Pen and her supporters have framed the verdict as a matter of political persecution. And while a recent poll found that 57% of French respondents felt that Le Pen's case was conducted without bias, that still leaves over 40% of the electorate who feel otherwise. Then there's the question of domestic stability, or lack thereof, in each nation. Brazil is no stranger to political violence where Bolsonaro is concerned, after over 1,500 supporters of Bolsonaro were detained after the storming and ransacking of the Brazilian Congress building, Presidential Palace and Supreme Court in 2023 after his presidential loss. Many within Bolsonaro's political coalition have worked to shift blame for those riots elsewhere, but those denials simply do not reflect the reality of that situation. Otherwise, Brazil is a nation that's generally safe from violent, non-political unrest, but is deeply politically polarized, with Bolsonaro and his political legacy firmly on one side of that divide. Brazilian NGOs have catalogued hundreds of individual instances of political violence and harassment each year from 2020 onward, and armed militias are known to have some degree of control over voting in some localities. France, meanwhile, has seen frequent political unrest in recent years, and that trend doesn't appear to be going away. Like Brazil, the nation is deeply polarized, and France ended the year 2024 in the midst of a political crisis. 2023 saw massive riots after the police killing of a 17-year-old of North African origin, while 2024 brought mass protests by farmers. In fact, riots, mass protest movements, and at times violent demonstrations have been a yearly occurrence in France through the 2010s and early 2020s, although it's rare that these instances of major unrest reflect strictly partisan allegiances. After Bolsonaro and Le Pen's popularity and their nation's recent history of unrest are accounted for, we can take stock of political off-ramps in the form of political alternatives, successors, and other means to bring down the heat. In both France and Brazil, political commentators have described a similar crossroads facing their respective political leader: help themselves at potential risk to the cause or help the cause by sacrificing themselves. Bolsonaro doesn't have a crystal clear successor, but after his son, a congressman named Eduardo, took a temporary leave from his seat and relocated to the US a few weeks ago, it appears that the likeliest option to succeed Bolsonaro the elder is the governor of Sao Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas. A former member of Bolsonaro's cabinet and now the leader of Brazil's richest state, de Freitas is more of a technocrat and tends a good deal more toward the political center than Bolsonaro does, even clashing with Bolsonaro in public at times. He's a favorite of the Brazilian conservative establishment, but that also makes him a dividing line between Bolsonaro-style politics and traditional conservatism. As a result, although he may make a promising candidate in 2027, he's not an appealing figure for Bolsonaro's most hardline supporters to place their faith in. And not only that, but Bolsonaro has very explicitly refused this opportunity to anoint either de Freitas or anybody else as a chosen successor. Said Bolsonaro on a radio program in late 2024 after already having been disqualified from the nation's next set of elections, quote, "I am plan A, plan B, and also plan C for the 2026 vote." Le Pen, by contrast, does have a successor, 29-year-old Jordan Bardella, who's led the National Rally Party since 2021. Despite his youth, Bardella is widely understood to be Le Pen's first choice by a wide margin, and Le Pen described him as having, quote, "the capacity to become president of the Republic" in a documentary broadcast just hours before her verdict was handed down. Bardella has been a parliamentarian since age 23. He's widely respected by the French hard right after securing major vote pickups in several elections, and he's been broadly forgiven by French supporters for occasional strategic slip-ups along the way. In the wake of Le Pen's verdict, Bardella has kept his own focus strictly off of himself, quoting him after Le Pen was found guilty, "Until we have fought this injustice and pursued all possible avenues to turn it around, I will refuse to put myself in this scenario." But as French media has highlighted, he appears to be the National Rally's backup plan in this scenario. As Bardella said himself in a 2024 interview, quote, "Not having a criminal record is, for me, rule number one when you want to be an MP." Bardella has made no secret of his devotion to Le Pen, and Le Pen has made it no secret that she has a fondness for Bardella, making the prospect of a clean, easy political handoff much more appealing than it seems in Brazil. Said Le Pen after the verdict, when asked about her protégé, "Jordan Bardella is a tremendous asset to the party, but I'm not going to let myself be eliminated like this. Millions of French people believe in me." For these reasons, even though the verdict and sentence against Le Pen is a far more decisive blow than the decision to simply have Bolsonaro stand trial, it's Brazil where the potential for future civil unrest seems to be higher. Or we should be specific, the potential for future civil unrest around Bolsonaro's prosecution seems to be higher. We can all but guarantee that France will be rioting during 2025 for some reason or another. The personal plight of Marine Le Pen, however, isn't likely to be the cause. Right now, the National Rally appears to have consensus on its path forward. Bardella is likely to inherit Le Pen's status as a frontrunner in 2027, and while there may be a fair bit of political protest against the Le Pen verdict, there's also an appeals process that can progress parallel to Bardella positioning himself as a future candidate. That would give the National Rally a chance at reclaiming its Plan A Le Pen candidacy, and shoring up its Plan B for Bardella at the same time. Add all that in a 2027 election that Le Pen indicated would be a last attempt to seek the presidency, meaning that at least the early work of succession planning has probably already been done. Finally, if Le Pen does lose on appeals, there's a decent strategic argument that the National Rally will be able to use her political martyrdom to boost Bardella even further. All told, the National Rally has a lot to gain and little more to lose by choosing to play the long game. Brazil, however, has no real shot at a resolution that would come so easily. Not only does Bolsonaro both lack a clear successor and lack the desire to even discuss succession publicly, but he's in a political system where no third party has a real shot at capturing his supporters' attention, and those same supporters are deeply alienated against the incumbent administration. Unlike the recent unrest in France, both Brazil's largest political riot of the 2020s and the broader undercurrent of political violence have been about Bolsonaro, his political movement, and his political opponents. The Supreme Court justice who launched the investigation against Bolsonaro is the same one that Bolsonaro and his co-conspirators are alleged to have tried to kill in what even some opponents of Bolsonaro have described as a worrying conflict of interest. Now, that same justice was also part of the 5-member panel that ordered Bolsonaro to stand trial and will ultimately render a verdict. The country is all but split down the middle on whether Bolsonaro plotted a coup, and Bolsonaro has explicitly accused Lula da Silva of using the prosecution to clear the way for a 4th Lula term in 2016, something that Bolsonaro alleges Brazil's same judiciary would approve if Bolsonaro doesn't stand in the way. Now, with the trial all but unavoidable, a nationwide perception of very high stakes around this moment, and few, if any, off-ramps for Bolsonaro supporters to rally any place else, Brazil's two political camps seem to be on a collision course. For what it's worth, the average Bolsonaro supporter does appear to be losing steam. Just 18,000 people turned out to a rally in Rio last month, according to an external monitoring group, when Bolsonaro had hoped to draw 1 million. But the most hardline of his supporters are most likely the same ones who've kept showing up. Luckily, the verdict against Marine Le Pen in France does not appear as if it'll precipitate any cascade of major political violence. For Brazil, however, we cannot say the same, and as the day to Bolsonaro's trials come closer and closer, we will be watching carefully for signs of the domestic unrest that seems likely to be lying ahead. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. And finally, we'll turn back to Europe, where amidst start-and-stop conversations around a ceasefire between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, a parallel European effort is battling headwinds. Amidst rising skepticism from the other members of a potential coalition of the willing, meant to station troops in or near Ukraine to provide a security guarantee from Russia, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are still working to keep optimism high. In fact, they've pledged that their coalition could rapidly deploy to Ukraine or surrounding nations if a peace deal were established, even if it came unexpectedly. But between the unpredictability of negotiations through Washington and the unclear cohesion of Britain and France's coalition so far, we've got to ask a tough question. If this coalition of the willing found out tomorrow that it needed to rapidly deploy to Ukraine, could it accomplish the task? First, let's get our bearings in Europe, where the guarded optimism of other continental leaders in their early response to Macron and Starmer's coalition proposal has been replaced by hesitance and dismay. Over the last few weeks, as America's Trump administration has seemed to broadly favor Russian interests and Ukraine has faced setbacks on the battlefield, European nations are privately signaling that a rethink is in order. Said one unnamed diplomat speaking to Reuters about their nation's new reticence, quote, "When Ukraine was in a better position, the idea of sending troops appealed. But now, with the situation on the ground and the US administration as it is, it's not very sexy." In particular, the nature of Ukraine and Russia's limited ceasefire agreement has raised eyebrows as Russia's concessions required Moscow to sacrifice very little in practice. A naval ceasefire in the Black Sea, where Ukrainian sea drones have been exceptionally successful against Russian warships, hurts Ukraine far more than Russia. On the other hand, a Russian halt to attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure is easy to accept in late March and early April, since those strikes were meant to expose Ukraine to the harsh Eastern European winter, which is now concluded. Those conditions, plus the apparent continuation of Russian strikes against energy infrastructure despite the ceasefire, seem to have been more than enough to convince more risk-averse European leaders that standing up to Russia with a military coalition is a futile endeavor. Macron and Starmer, however, are still moving on with their coalition of the willing proposal, most recently with the gathering in Paris on March 27th that featured Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, Italian leader Giorgia Meloni, and other representatives of relatively strong NATO militaries. At that gathering, Macron reiterated France and Britain's continued desire to lead their coalition and provide Ukraine a security guarantee, despite other nations, including Italy, continuing to emphasize that they've ruled out the deployment of their own troops. The same concerns popped up that these nations had expressed before: the lack of clear support from the United States, the preference of all involved nations to avoid actual confrontations with Russia, and more. Those concerns in turn led to the same fair questions about feasibility that this coalition proposal already faces. How can such an idea ever be put into action if this elusive support from the US remains a prerequisite? And how can it be a credible deterrent if European leaders openly admit they'd work to avoid actually fighting Russia? Other than Britain and France, it's not clear which nations are open to placing boots on the ground or would even have the ability to do so. And it's here we return to the question of the day. With those lasting concerns in mind, is it even possible that Britain and France could go about squaring that circle and manage to provide a rapid deployment in support of Ukraine in the event that Kyiv and Moscow agree to a full truce? After all, this is something that Britain and France openly acknowledge needs to happen fast if it's going to happen at all. Prevailing fear around a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, both in Europe and elsewhere, is that Russia will simply use a temporary truce to reconsolidate its forces, reset, and engage in an even more destructive push at a more convenient time. So, how would that actually work? Well, to start with, it doesn't appear that French and British troops would be the only ones deployed. Although they have yet to give firm pledges on troop numbers, the NATO nations of Sweden and Denmark, as well as the key partner nation of Australia in the South Pacific, are all expected to provide soldiers on the ground, and Belgium has indicated that it would also participate. Turkey is a likely contributor, especially in a moment when positive engagement with NATO on this matter would buy Turkey's leaders a bit of forgiveness for domestic unrest and authoritarian power grabs back home. While some of the larger NATO militaries have ruled out the idea of deploying troops, like Italy, Greece, and Poland, others have yet to take a public stance either way, notably Spain. Across the world, Japan is also expected to play a role, while other NATO nations, even if they aren't willing to position troops on the ground, might be interested in sending air, sea, or logistical support of varying kinds. That includes some of the same larger militaries that have made clear they won't be sending soldiers directly to Ukrainian soil. As for how Europe could maximize the value of a deterrent, it's clear that the answer is not through a frontline deployment. Macron has already explained that this coalition force will not be stationed in frontline areas, even in peacetime, but that it would instead set up a presence on the ground in Ukraine at key strategic locations. Those would include cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa, power stations and other critical energy infrastructure, major ports, and perhaps important Ukrainian military bases. Not only that, but European leaders have been expressing for months that ground troops aren't the only deterrents they're looking to place in Ukraine. In fact, current estimates call for ground troops in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands paired with air and naval elements coming to support. Then there's the question of rapid deployment, where although force readiness across NATO nations isn't exactly fantastic, the alliance does have some options. Chief among them is the Allied Reaction Force Brigade, technically a NATO asset, but under the direction of British troops and already present on the ground in Romania, not far from the Ukrainian border. The commander of the force has indicated that British soldiers within the ARF are ready to respond, in keeping with the ARF's ability to deploy on a few days' notice. The force is thousands strong and would allow the coalition of the willing to place a relatively substantial first wave of troops on the ground, pending further transfers to back them up. Although the many nations that contribute troops to the ARF don't all consent to stationing personnel in Ukraine, ARF forces who are a part of willing militaries may be able to break off from the larger force and travel in ahead. An arrangement to that effect would need to be worked out behind closed doors, but that's something that NATO members should be capable of. Once that's done, even the presence of a relatively small number of uniformed coalition troops in Ukrainian cities or positioned near other strategic targets may at least be enough to force Russia to slow its roll a bit and let the early stages of a ceasefire play out. From there, it'll be on European nations to get more troops to Ukraine as quickly as possible. This is an area where the United States' support would be incredibly helpful, leveraging America's unmatched capacity for strategic airlift. But since the intent of this coalition force is to deter further Russian aggression rather than fight Russia head-on, its airlift demands won't be quite as extreme as they otherwise might be. Taken together, the air forces of NATO's 6 strongest non-US air forces, Turkey, France, Italy, Germany, Greece, and the UK, have over 200 suitable tactical airlifters in their arsenals. Even a relatively small portion of those, say 10 A400M Atlas planes and 5 C-17 Globemasters, could combine to transport over 1,800 fully equipped troops on a single collective shuttle run. Assume, let's say, a group shuttle run every 3 days, and a European coalition could station an additional 10,000 troops in Ukraine to back up those initial forces within barely 2 weeks of those shuttle runs beginning. And to Europe's credit, that's a conservative estimate of both how many aircraft could be dedicated and how often they could turn around for subsequent flights, although Other logistical concerns, like getting troops to air bases, putting together supplies, and more, do present the risk of further delay. After a couple of weeks, road and rail transport into Ukraine becomes viable, allowing for the creation and sustainment of a force that wouldn't be big enough to fight Russia directly, but would certainly be big enough to scatter troops to Ukraine's strategic locations and deter Russia from hitting them in the future. Moving beyond the provision of ground troops, this coalition of the willing could most likely provide the greatest deterrent coverage in the shortest amount of time by stationing aircraft either at Ukrainian air bases or in forward deployment zones on Romanian or Polish soil. This is an effort that even nations that have refused to place troops on the ground could still be a part of if they'd like to opt into a coalition. For nations like Poland, it might be as simple as shifting around some air assets within that country rather than sending them abroad at all. For other nations, positioning fighter jets in Poland or keeping naval vessels in Turkish coastal waters would keep their assets firmly secure under the NATO umbrella. Because of Ukraine's close proximity to the Mediterranean Sea, naval assets could start arriving within days as soon as they're dispatched. It's in these areas that potentially reticent nations might find ways to contribute directly, either by stationing combat assets or by lending logistical support to make these deployments happen, while the most enthusiastic participants handle the deployment of soldiers inside Ukraine. Unfortunately, even the best laid plans risk falling apart if these member nations' worst fears are realized and Russia chooses this moment to test European resolve. After all, the entire reason that this coalition of the willing exists is so Europe can station assets in and around Ukraine without risking that a Russian attack would trigger a collective response by all of NATO. It's only by finding a loophole and getting around that obligation that so many European nations are willing to even entertain this idea, so that if something goes sideways, they aren't obligated to fight a war with Russia in order to make things right. What that means, however, is that these European troops will be stepping outside the shadow of NATO's collective defense, and that Vladimir Putin's Russia may either act with an apparent recklessness or disregard for them to provoke a confrontation, or even attack them directly in order to throw down the gauntlet. Russia has made it abundantly clear that for Moscow, the deployment of any European force into Ukraine is a non-starter. And with every indication that France, Britain, and other nations intend to push that boundary, Moscow must understand that it's going to need to step up. When asked about that very prospect, Macron has explained that European troops stationed in Ukraine could respond if they were attacked by Russia. Quoting him here, "If there was, again, a generalized aggression against Ukrainian soil, these armies would, in fact, be under attack, and then it's our usual framework of engagement." That is to say, the coalition would respond to a Russian assault against Ukraine anyway, even if it didn't directly target coalition soldiers. Yet for European leaders, the troops on the ground in a hypothetical deployment, and the European public writ large, that's a much easier promise to make before troops are deployed than it will be if the moment of truth finally arrives. If these troops are deployed to Ukraine, even if they're kept far from the front lines, then they and their commanders cannot make the assumption that Vladimir Putin would avoid calling their bluff. How they respond to a direct provocation will determine whether the coalition of the willing is worth anything at all. So, can European nations rapidly deploy to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire? Yes. Not if the goal is to assemble an army for an all-out war, but they can rapidly deploy an early portion of a deterrent force that would grow over the course of a couple of months. Of course, as they do, however, they face the very real risk that Putin will choose his moment, choose his circumstances, and find out just how willing Europe's coalition really is. Thank you for watching.